Well, the British pound hit a 37-year low on Friday as the country continues to grapple with skyrocketing inflation and climbing energy prices. This week, the Bank of England will make another rate hike decision after raising rates 50 basis points in August. And all of this as the nation mourns the death of Queen Elizabeth, which raises questions about unity during what has already been an increasingly divisive decade in the UK. For more on all of this, let's bring in Dartmouth University professor of economics, Danny Blanchflower. Danny, it's been a moment. It's good to see you after quite a while. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Let's talk about the backdrop in the UK, right? Because obviously, as I just alluded to, there are a lot of cross currents, and the Queen has frequently been referred to as the glue that held the nation together, although there wasn't much holding together, frankly, from a political perspective as of late. Where do you think the UK goes now from an economic perspective?
Well, obviously, the nation's come together in the last 10 days, and I was just watching these amazing scenes in London with thousands and thousands of people lining the streets, and it's a bank holiday. But the reality is there's a new government in place, that 81,000 people voted for the new prime minister, noting that 81 million people voted for Biden. And so we have a very sort of divided nation, and we're going to have an economic plan which I think looks completely and utterly out of touch with the reality, which is that ordinary people are confronted with really high bills that they're going to have to pay. And I don't see really anything that's going to confront that. I mean, if you start to talk about tax cuts and corporation tax cuts and changing the remit of the Bank of England, that may be fine, but that's not going to have any effect this winter. So there's a great deal of discontent, not only amongst the people, but actually amongst the Tory MPs, only 20% of whom voted for this government. And so inevitably, markets are going to respond. I wrote a column about a month ago, said the thing that's really going to matter for Liz Truss is going to be the foreign exchange market, the bond market, and the stock market. And none of those, as you're showing right now, none of those is really holding up. So I think we're in deep crisis. We're in deep crisis for the winter. And illustrative of it is that the beaches where I was born in Brighton, well, the beaches from Brighton to Hastings have been closed because of sewage being dumped on the beaches. And so that's a sort of indicator that the crisis mode is coming. It's going to be a winter of considerable discontent.
Wow. As I think about what you were just laying out there, I'm sorry, I got distracted by the sewage beaches for a moment.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, it's a big deal. But then additionally, you started to talk about UK Prime Minister Liz Truss. After this period of mourning, what is the first thing that you expect the Prime Minister to immediately begin to tackle?
Well, they're going to announce some scheme to try and pull back on the energy prices. And they're going to have a scheme whereby basically the government steps in and basically funds the cost of kind of keeping the thing down. But it's going to fund it through taxation. It's going to fund it through borrowing. And there's a great call that there should be a windfall tax on the energy companies who've done so well for this. Large majority of the country supports it, and we're not going to see any of that. And we're going to see announcements of things like free ports, as I say, and fairly right-wing stuff. But the question I always ask, I like to talk about what I call the woman on the Mile End Road omnibus. And the Mile End Road is 1 mile from the City of London, and it's like two worlds. And the question you and your viewers should ask is, what are they going to announce this week that will help that woman pay her bills and prevent herself from freezing or starving? And I think that's really where we are. The government doesn't appear to have any clue about any of that. So she's in deep trouble from the moment she comes into office. And we'll see what they do. But and the Bank of England is going to raise rates quite clearly in the depths of a recession. And they appear to be making exactly the same mistakes as they made in 2008. You don't raise rates in the depths of a recession, which is clearly coming. You probably should be cutting rates, not raising them. And the only issue is going to be how quick it is before they have to start cutting. I mean, the reality is the pound is falling because of confidence in the markets, lack of confidence in the markets on the economic policies of this government and the Bank of England. So I think we're in, I guess the word I would use is British economic policy is in disarray.
Danny, at the same time, and by the way, you say all of this about the Bank of England as a former policymaker yourself at the Bank of England. What choice do they have, though? I mean, in other words, it's like here with the Federal Reserve that when you have inflation going up at this rate, how does the central bank say, no, we're not going to raise rates in the face of that?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously, it depends on the source of that inflation, and it's essentially been driven by two shocks: the COVID shock and a war in Ukraine. I mean, interestingly, if you go to the Bank of England's forecast, so the question is, you always think about what is inflation going to look like 2 years out? That's what they actually have to respond to. And in their most recent forecast, they say that in 2 years' time, inflation is going to be well below target. There's a 55% probability of it being below 1 and a 20% or so probability of deflation. Inflation's going to tumble. And they're also forecasting declines in output over the next 3 years. So how is raising rates in the depths of a recession with output falling, how does that help matters? The answer is that this is exactly what they said in July and August 2008. We've got to worry about inflation. And within 6 months, we were in deflation. So I think the reality is their rhetoric has been wrong. Yes, we've been hit by inflation. And yes, a large part of it has to do with the B word nobody wants to talk about, Brexit, which is why the UK has done so badly. But in essence, the central bank is now going to push the UK into recession. And what will that do? It's going to end up having to cut rates. So my view is that they've got themselves into a double bind, but inflation is going to tumble. And they certainly should not be raising rates this week. No doubt of that whatsoever. Same rhetoric as they gave in August 2008, when they suddenly realized that trouble was brewing and had already brewed.
A lot to address after this period of mourning, after the funeral takes place for the UK economy. But for where the people are right now, both in tenor and just in the pulse of the country, what is the vibe there, for lack of a better word, after they come out of this period of mourning, especially given all these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, we started out with talking about the water companies that were privatized. Price of water went up, and we've just talked about sewage on the beaches. So that's caused great consternation. But I think you have to look at what's happened to public services, and especially what's happened to the National Health Service. It's unclear that this government is actually going to address that. There are over 100,000 vacancies. People can't get appointments with doctors, and impossible to get appointments with dentists. And thousands of people are waiting to get into emergency rooms. So there's a general sense of malaise. And I think the big story is a complete collapse in consumer confidence. Consumer confidence predicts pretty well what's coming. The consumer confidence in the UK now is below what it was in 2007 and 8. It's lower than it was ever in the history of the index, starting in 1974. So the confidence of the people, the availability of public services, their confidence in a government. We've had 3 prime ministers in no time flat. So I think that's a really big deal. And obviously the issue particularly is going to be, is this government actually going to be able to get any of its policies through the parliament, given that Tory MPs didn't vote for it? And many of them will be thinking, particularly the 50 or so, what's called the red wall, if they go along with this, does that mean they're going to end up losing their seat? So I don't think I've ever seen such disarray, such discontent, but held together by the Queen, the nation's grandma, who I met at Buckingham Palace some years ago, and obviously the nation has come together for that. But then the question is, follow that act. Truss needs to follow that act, and I don't think she has it. She has it in her to do that. And if you listen to the pronouncement she made on the campaign trail, they seem to me to have come from Gaga land.
And Danny, the portrait that you're painting here seems to sort of imply that the death of Queen Elizabeth symbolically marks the end of UK dominance as a world and economic power. I mean, would you go so far as to say that?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, the king has made, the new king, in a sense, has kind of beholden himself to the people, and the people have sort of embraced him. But it's a pretty darned hard act to follow, as he clearly knows. In some sense, you might think the pronouncements the king has made as Prince Charles stand really very much in contradistinction to what this government has been saying. So there may be a banging of heads. But obviously, what we've seen since Brexit is that the UK has gone, its position in the world has declined. It sits on the outside of various deals. It has this huge community close to it where it used to be able to contribute to and alter things. Now it sits on the outside. And obviously a big issue will be presumably why POTUS didn't meet with Truss this week is the possibility that they're going to try and break the Irish protocol, which will actually have an impact on Irish peace accords. So President Biden didn't meet with, even though he was in London down the road, hasn't actually met with Truss. So there's going to be issues about, is the Western alliance going to come together if she tries to break the Irish peace accords? What is Britain an outlier? And I think this is really a cusp moment, and we will see. But the great question in the UK is, can this government survive through the winter? Can they do things for the ordinary person? This woman, as I said, on the Mile End Road omnibus, it starts a mile from Aldgate, and two worlds come together, the world of the City of London, and the government says our first policy is to increase the cap on bonuses for city folk, where a mile down the road at the London hospital where my daughter was born, nurses can't get decent pay levels, doctors aren't being hired. The two worlds come together, and the question is, can the Prime Minister and the new King bring them together? And the answer is, with this Prime Minister, I seriously doubt it.
Well, the great question that one of our viewers is asking this morning is, why are there still kings and queens? And so that is perhaps a much larger conversation for another time. Yeah. Dartmouth University Professor of Economics, Danny Blanchflower, thanks so much for taking the time here this morning. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.